Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Welcome to today's revision session. Now, hopefully, you should be able to hear me today because I've just done this and realised that my microphone was not plugged in. Okay, so today we're going to be going over economic inequality and, in particular, social segregation as a branch off of inequality. So let's get into it, shall we? So, some key terms for this session are, in no particular order, cultural diversity. So this is a variety of different cultures or ethnic groups in a society. A good way to think about this is if you were to walk down the high street of a community, what different restaurants and takeaways and types of food would you see on that high street? So that's a good way to think about the different cultures that are there, okay? Then we have diaspora, which are people with a similar heritage or homeland that have settled elsewhere, okay? So we'll come into this later as we get into the ethnic dimensions, right? Next we have, of course, economic inequality, which is the differences between levels or standards of living in a population or society. And we can think about this as a scale with rags to riches, okay? And finally, of course, we have social segregation, which are groups of people living apart based on wealth, age, ethnicity, or faith, okay? So, what is meant by economic inequality? So, firstly, it's a key feature in Asia, Africa, and South America. It's known as the wealth gap. And just take a minute to think about what do these countries have in common, okay? These not countries, sorry, these locations. What do these have in common? And you should come to the conclusion that they're all newly emerging economies, so NEEs, or in old tongue, LEDCs, lesser economically developed countries. And again, like I said, a good way to think about this scale is a scale of rags on one end to riches. So if there is a great amount of economic inequality, this scale will be really broad, okay? Another good way of remembering it is to think about images like this where we have very, very poor people next to like incredibly lavish cars and an amazing quality of life. So you can see here the economic inequality in this region, okay? So this brings us to Antilia and his 27-story home. This brings us to Antilia, the 27-story home of Mukesh Ambani. And Mr. Ambani owns a $21 million home, and he's able to afford this because he's a chairman of a global energy conglomerate. Okay. Now, the reason this home is significant is because it's overlooking the slum of Baikula in Mumbai, India. Now, this is one of the largest slums. It has 9 million slum dwellers, okay? And these people are living on, at max, $2 a day, at max, or on average, okay? Now, you can see here the economic inequality because we've got all these people living in these terrible, terrible conditions, incredible poverty. And then we've got Mr. Ambani's home here, overlooking it all, kind of like an emperor you can think of. So now, what are some of the issues of social segregation? Again, this is people being physically segregated from each other, kept apart from each other because of their age, wealth, faith, ethnicity, stuff like this. So it can lead to classism. So these wealthy people can think, oh, I'm better than you. I don't need to help you and stuff like that. It can lead to isolation of these poorer communities because they feel like they've got no help in the world. It can lead to racism, again, because we get these segregations based on ethnicity and race. And then we have different diaspora and ethnic dimensions, which we're going to touch on later. It creates animosity between these groups because they're not interacting with each other, and so they might consider them all criminals and then not want to help them. And then this increased crime rate, it isn't because they're bad people, it's just because their quality of life is so much more difficult, and it's so difficult for them to get a comfortable state in their life that they have to turn to crime in order to make ends meet. And the final 2 points is we get a lack of support and services in these areas because no one wants to invest in them, okay? And you can imagine what these last two can do to keep these people in poverty throughout their life, okay? So we know what social segregation is, and the issues that it can cause, but what are the causes of social segregation? So there's three in total. So our first one is housing developments. Second one being changes in environment, and a final one being ethnic dimensions. So these are the causes of social segregation in terms of where people are going to be living. Okay. So first off, we've got housing developments. So when people are constructing homes in a city, they'll build them in blocks. Okay. And they'll design these blocks for a specific type of customer in mind. So, for instance, a more wealthy person or more affordable housing for people on lower incomes. Okay. So, as you can imagine, if you're building some really expensive homes and then one home on every block is an affordable house, you can imagine that the prices of that block would plummet, and these investors and developers would actually lose their profits because no one's willing to pay high enough because there's affordable housing attached to it. And again, this leads back to the issues of it with animosity and stuff like that. Okay, so what we find is that wealthier homes are like physically built further away than more affordable ones, and this leads to segregation, as we've just touched on. Now, these wealthy homes have nicer facilities, as we just mentioned, whereas poorer ones are a bit worse, and they have less choice in where they live. Okay, and we can see here we've got like blocks of flats in London, which are very affordable, compared to a gated community, again segregated with a physical gate. Okay, we have a gated community to keep the riffraff, as they would say, out. Now, here we have a quick map of the average property prices in London. Okay, you can see here the darker the colour, the more expensive they are. Looking at the key, we can see that it's very centralised around central London. Kind of goes around this area, right? And as you can see, this area is very expensive to live in. You're going up towards the million mark, whereas the periphery of London, periphery meaning outside, the periphery of London is much, I'm not going to say much more affordable, but less expensive in comparison, because these are still expensive, no doubt. Okay. Again, here we can see that the difference in pricing in London of types of homes. So detached homes being the most expensive and flats being the least expensive. We can have a look at this and think, well, which people are going to be living in flats? Well, they're less expensive, so it's going to be people on lower incomes, whereas those in a detached home will be those who earn quite a lot more. And then we'll find that you don't really find detached homes next to flats. So again, we can see how they're physically segregated. Okay. So now this brings us on to changes in the environment. And when we say environment in this context, we don't mean the natural environment. We're thinking of a cityscape as an environment. So I think you'll understand it a bit better as we talk through it. So originally we might get homes built for Georgian or Victorian families, okay? And back then they had a culture of having many children, okay? So they need big homes, right? However, as time's passed and people have less children, these homes are now too big for modern UK families. So what we find is that these homes are being divided and sublet as affordable housing. So what this means is each bedroom is an individual accommodation for someone. Again, this is for the purposes of being for providing homes, affordable homes for people on less economic income. Okay. Now, here we can see how these people might become segregated as we get poorer people typically congregating in these areas of Georgian or Victorian homes. Now, on the other hand, we have a process called gentrification, okay? And what this is where a poor area slowly becomes a rich area through investment in different businesses. So it might start out as a art studio, and then people going to the art studio might go to a cafe. And then you start to get more and more development in these areas and more business. And then slowly over time you'll get a hotel, and then a major building is constructed for a business, and then it brings in people and the area becomes gentrified. And you might think this is a good thing because this area that was once poor is now rich. Well, it's actually quite the opposite, because these poor people that live there, they can no longer afford to live there, and their homes are seen as being in the way. So these people get evicted and kicked out and shoved elsewhere. And this is why I personally think of it is it's like a second wave of urban sprawl, because all these people, you have urban sprawl first, which is the urban area expanding outwards, and then you have like a gentrification wave, which is where the poor areas spreading outwards will become gentrified, and people will be moved further and further out of the centre. You can see here these blocks of flats probably won't be there very soon because we've got gentrification slowly creeping up on them. Okay, and here is an example of properties being sublet for quite expensive, £900 a week. Yeah, again, examples of how a changing cityscape can lead to social segregation. So now this leaves us with our final cause of social segregation in terms of housing, and this is the ethnic dimensions. Okay, so what this means is when immigrants arrive into a different country, they'll typically not have a very competitive edge in terms of the job market. And what this means is they face discrimination in the search for jobs. Okay, and what this means is they have very limited options of either being unemployed and trying to live off benefits or state support, or they get very low paying jobs in factories or picking fruit or cleaning and stuff like that, very labour intensive jobs that don't pay very well. And now, because they're not very competitive, for the most part, you do get some where they come over with qualifications in different fields, like doctors, for example. So because most of these people can't get very good jobs, they can only afford cheap housing, and therefore, as we've seen, since they can only afford cheap housing, they start to become very segregated and closed off from other people. Now, this can have intergenerational effects because we have poor people being raised in poor areas where they don't have great facilities, and then this means that they may struggle to climb out of this poverty. Okay, and again, as I just said, newer immigrants concentrate in poor areas. And what this map is showing, and this is a map of London, and it's showing the percentage of Asian population depending on borough, I believe. Now, if you remember the map earlier, we had the most expensive housing, and that was more centered in this region, kind of had an offshoot going up here and down here. And what we can see is this is actually the gaps in our map, because these are the largely Asian populations here, and we can see that this is where the cheaper housing was. Now, again, you can see how these people are segregated, so there is a lack of interaction between these people, and that's because, again, they can't afford very nice housing, and therefore physically separated in terms of where they live. So let me get back to my laser pointer. So we can see here how our factors of sorry, bless you. Our factors of housing, so the type of housing that's created, how changes in environment can lead to gentrification or places that were formerly rich becoming poor. And we can see how ethnic dimensions all tie together to cause people to be segregated based on economic inequality of a region. And in this case, we took the area of London. Okay, so I hope you've enjoyed the session today and it sparked some memories, as again, this is only a revisionary session. So yeah, I hope you've been taking lots of notes and enjoyed, and wish you all the luck in your exam. Goodbye.